And one. All right. Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Call the Lawyers Podcast, episode number 4. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is legal advice, certainly not investment advice or anything like it. If you've seen our previous podcasts, you know it's not even close. And today we have with us our dear friend from the legal working group, Rebecca Rettig, the one and only. Rebecca, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Ron? Thank you for having me.
I am doing well, thank you. I want to start by thanking you because you recommended the topic, and I am grateful that we're not talking about Telegram at all today. Kick. And all of the different legislative activities happening in Washington, D.C. So the topic today is DeFi. Yeah. And you've been deeply immersed in this stuff for quite a while. We've had the privilege of being on panels and together at some of our events. DeFi to me always seems to be one of those topics where if you grab a bunch of people in a room and ask them what DeFi is or open finance, you get 20 responses. So let's level set a little bit. What's your definition of DeFi and open finance, and what does that mean from a legal perspective?
Okay, so I would define DeFi as a technological movement towards decentralizing legacy finance. So decentralizing legacy financial institutions, financial instruments, financial use cases. Different things that fall under that are trading, lending, payments, insurance, things like that. So almost like a modern technological wealth management system. So I think that's a pretty sort of fair 101 definition of DeFi. What does it mean for law and regulation? I think it means what we talk a lot about in the legal working group and otherwise as lawyers, which is decentralized doesn't mean unregulated. And so it has a lot of implications, because if you're mimicking legacy financial institutions, which are highly regulated, you really have to undertake an analysis of your project and whether it's regulated. The answer is probably yes. How it is regulated, and by whom. So, who, what, when, where, why, and how, usual kind of.
And it's funny, the conversations when you talk to the technologists in this space, and just to digress a little bit, the perception that some of them seem to have about DeFi is almost the perception they had a while back of, well, it's not currency, it's not security, we'll issue tokens, it's the brave new world of inventing financial markets. And that's absolutely not the case. There are clear indications that some of the DeFi work requires a thought about the legal and regulatory aspects of it.
100%. I will say that a lot of the actors in the space that I work with are really trying to have a very developed approach to it from a capital markets or legacy finance perspective. Not everybody is saying, okay, fine, we're probably a bank and trying to be, regulated by the OCC. But I do think that people are trying to think deeply about the spirit of the various regulations that apply, how they can comply with the laws, either to the letter of the law or certainly with the spirit, because a lot of decentralized finance works towards transparency for investors, no asymmetry of information, investor protection by having things like over collateralization and things like that. So there's an aspect of both trying to comply with the letter and the spirit of the law. If you deal with maybe a hardcore technologist, they may not have the same view toward it, but anybody who's creating DeFi as a business, I think, is thinking about it or knows they need to think about it.
And that's interesting because some of the conversations, if you turn that around a bit, are DeFi, open finance. Let's throw in smart contracts to that conversation. They can be tools for some of the things that have been challenges in financial markets and for financial inclusion before. And it could be from a regulatory perspective around embargoed actors in global financial markets. It could be approvals, KYC, AML type stuff that would take much longer in the legacy financial world.
Right.
How involved are you in some of that? And I know you've got several clients in this space, so we don't want to get into specifics, but how applicable is that in some of what you're seeing?
One of the reasons that I love DeFi so much is that it really does promote financial inclusion. One of the barriers to having full financial inclusion is the technological aspect to that. But once we get over that hurdle, and I think people are doing things like creating apps and making things that make it much more accessible on your phone or something like that, that there will be, and it's going to take a little while, but I think there will be an explosion of DeFi and really bringing finance to a lot of different individuals and actors that couldn't necessarily have it before. I think of something like, there are lots of different investing tools now that you can do via an app that's different than DeFi because it probably doesn't have the decentralized aspect to it, but it does have the open finance aspect to it. So
you mean like a Robinhood, for example, or
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean, it is expediting certain old world or legacy finance features. But it also, that requires a lot of technological development, a lot of thought of how to do it correctly. And the AML KYC part of it is really probably the most challenging when you're talking about a decentralized protocol. If you have a front end, that allows access to it, it's very different.
So a couple of points there that I want to stop with, and we have colleagues that work in the nonprofit world, global organizations trying to aid unbanked and underbanked refugees, for example. Mm-hmm. Where does DeFi open finance play in that space? And I think part of the challenge for them is, you mentioned apps, right? Part of the challenge for some of these individuals is that last mile. Like, how do they get this access? And we've been talking for decades in financial markets about inclusion in the underbanked, but they still can't get access even to the new technologies. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I will say and this was not quite recently, but the last time I was in sort of a developing country, iPhones were pretty ubiquitous, or, Android phones where you could have apps. So to the extent that that's a goal of DeFi or open finance, and I think for a certain portion of people involved in DeFi, it is the development of apps which give you access to some of these types of platforms is going to be really critical. Yeah. Because otherwise, I think it's too hard.
Right. So do you worry then that open finance and DeFi really are going to be problematic for the developed world versus the developing world, where they may not have all of the overhang of incumbents, for example, in the space and legacy technology? What are your thoughts about that?
It might take off faster there, but I think you have two different issues going on, both of which you identified. Here, you may have the incumbents and people who are not willing or have a resistance to thinking of technology taking over their legacy finance, both retail investors who may, mom and pop, who may not want to see their bank accounts or something really under a technological umbrella. And then you have the access issue when you're in the developed world. Because the other thing I'll say is, going to computer cafe still requires a long run up. It's not, instantaneous, like when you're in a developing country. It's not the same as you might have here. But I do think that there's a lot of thought being given to the way open finance can work abroad or in the developing countries. And that may be a way to really have it take off while there may be more resistance in the developed world.
Right. And I think the example that a lot of colleagues that we speak to, they point to China, for example. When you look at the ubiquity of, oh God, why is it slipping my mind? WeChat, or the payment platform that they have. So it's an interesting take on that. From the perspective of getting involved in DeFi, I've spent way too much time with lawyers. So this is going to sound like a pitch for law and lawyers, but I often tell colleagues, your first conversation outside of the what problem are you trying to solve is talk to an attorney. What's that conversation like? Again, you advise a lot of organizations. You have a lot of organizations that are clients. What's your advice about those first steps in the DeFi and open finance space?
So I think that it's really important to have a talk with a lawyer early on in your development, because what's most amazing to me when I'm working with clients is where you identify a legal or a regulatory problem, and in the DeFi space, there may be a technological solution to it where they can program differently, whitelist things, and really take a technological aspect to cutting out some of the things that may actually give rise to regulatory concerns. So the sooner a DeFi project can talk to a lawyer, and a lawyer who understands the technology, the better. And look, we also talk to clients in between version 1 of the protocol while they're building version 2 or doing upgrades or something like that. That's also a really important time. Just because you've built your protocol, you can't just throw up your hands and say, well, this is it. And that's not what people are doing anyway. They're continuing to build and develop and upgrade. So talking to a lawyer to make sure that you can identify whatever regulatory issues you may have coded into your protocol is important.
Are you concerned? Well, let me stop there for a moment. How deep into the technology do you have to get? I often talk to law students. We have several interns, for example, within the organization, the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance, that are in law school or have just graduated, who have been more involved in technology than they thought they'd ever would need to be. How does that impacted you? And obviously you're not coding. I don't think you're coding.
I'm actually just signed up to take my first coding class.
What are you taking?
I don't know. My kids are taking coding because I think it's very important them to be coders. So I signed up to do it too. I think I'm doing Python.
Nice. I did likewise. I signed up for a Coursera course on Python, and I haven't even started it yet. But how deeply into the technology have you had to go with clients and colleagues in this space? What does that look like for you? At some point you say, I have no idea what you're talking about.
So I definitely don't have coding conversations, but I talk about what you can put in the code to make something happen. Because as we just discussed, I don't know how to code yet. But you have to understand how it all fits together. You have to understand where the Oracle is pulling prices from. You have to understand who actually, this is really important, who has control over certain aspects of the protocol, especially if you're thinking about whether something is actually decentralized or moderately decentralized. So you do have to understand how the Lego blocks, as a lot of people talk about them in DeFi, fit together. And the more you understand it, the better advice you can give.
Yeah. And you hit on something that we find really important across the organization is that governance conversation. Right. And it started with the governance conversations around public open blockchains. How important is governance in the models of DeFi and open finance? And what do people and organizations getting involved need to think about when they structure governance?
Yeah, you need to make your governance plan really early because governance is complicated to actually effectuate, and to do it correctly, I think also is complicated. And so you need to make a long-term plan about what point in time you want to implement governance. Some people do it really early in their project. I don't think that should mean that because you have a governance system where the developers aren't involved in every decision and they have a DAO, let's say, very early on. It does not mean you're fully decentralized. And I think that is a common misconception that people should make sure they stay away from. But governance needs to be tested in a secure way, the same way you test the protocol itself. Both the security of it in terms of how you've built the governance system, and then you need to have, I think, a potential testing period or a period where you see how it's working before you the developers let go completely. And I think we've seen a lot of projects in the DeFi open finance space handle it like that, where you don't just build it, set it off and go, but you still have some company level involvement. And I think it's important to do that at the beginning of governance.
Right. So are you talking about almost like the penetration testing, cybersecurity testing, but related to governance? In other words, test it out to see if you break it? Is that the kind of mindset?
Well, you definitely need to because the governance systems are normally built, on a same way type of protocol, you certainly need to do those types of testing, the security testing that you're talking about. You need to have an audit. But I think you need to have a testing period where you see how your governance is working in a meaningful way with maybe a set group of actors within the ecosystem you've built or something like that, just to see how it works in practice before you let it go and have everybody have access to it immediately.
Right. To the extent you can talk about it, how prevalent or concerning are the challenges around hacks and cybersecurity for some of these platforms? I know we referenced it in the emails back and forth between each other. And again, neither of us being coders, but you can almost anticipate as soon as a DeFi project's launched, someone's going to try to hack it in some way. What are those conversations like?
So that I can't get into too much, and I don't do tons of audit work, but what I will say is I think people are we've seen hacks, everybody, we've seen a lot of hacks in the DeFi space over the last 6 months for sure. And certainly in the more recent months, we've seen pretty significant ones. But I think doing your audit is really important, and taking your audit seriously is really important. Just doing it is not enough. You need to take it, digest it, and understand if your audit is saying you have more things to fix before you deploy or not.
Are you looking at the larger consultative services firms from the audit perspective? So I'm going to shamelessly plug WSBA a little bit, but in our accounting working group, and we have partnerships with AICPA and some of the accounting practices that are looking to what's an audit of blockchain look like? What's an audit of a DeFi platform look like? What are those audit conversations? To the extent
I have not. Are you talking about security audit, or are you talking about an actual accounting audit?
I mean more the security audit. Like, who are they bringing to the table to help them with those security audits?
Oh, I think there are established firms who are doing it. So I'm not going to give any plugs for anybody in particular,
Sure.
But there are established security audit firms who do it and provide reports and frequently make their reports open and public. So,
Got it. And I was also looking through our past notes. If you remember the conversation, and this is not on the script, and this is not part of the emails that you and I shared, but the safe harbor recommendations from Commissioner Peirce. Does DeFi fit into that? And again, I know that that's a proposal that hasn't moved forward, but how important does DeFi make the urgency of something like a safe harbor?
So I actually talked to Commissioner Peirce on Saturday at a different conference. I sort of specifically stayed away from her safe harbor because I feel like she's talked about it so much, but it automatically came up when we were talking about DeFi because of this that she thinks DeFi, and this is not my opinion, and I know her opinion doesn't represent that of the SEC, but our conversation veered into the fact that DeFi almost fits into what she's thinking about for the safe harbor, where you have a known entity building a network. They may have done a traditional equity raise, right? They don't necessarily even have tokens. And they spend 2 to 3 years building up their network, building up the ecosystem, seeing network effects. And then they step away, within 2 or 3 years and say, okay, now we're decentralized and something like that. So it did naturally come up in the DeFi context. Do I think and she actually said she had gotten some positive feedback from her fellow commissioners. Is there an urgency for it? I mean, we have a regulatory framework. I know not everybody loves it, and we
Some
sort of
don't want to believe that.
I mean, we do. It makes things a little complicated, but we have an existing regulatory framework, and that's what people need to be working in right now.
Yeah. So this is our short form podcast, and it's already been 15 minutes.
Okay.
A couple of things, a lot, which I could go on for hours talking to you about this stuff. Lawyer working from home. How hard is it?
It's challenging, but it's not. My firm that I'm with is the first distributed law firm in the United States. And so one of the key features of it is working from home. There's no requirement to go to an office. So I've actually been doing this for about the last year and a half before this happened. I didn't know I was being so prescient, but so it's more challenging because there are more people in the house right now. And I have other responsibilities, homeschooling and things like that. But it's been okay.
Good. Last question, and we usually try to ask now I know you're not a coder, but you're learning coding. What have you been binge watching?
I have been binge watching, and I just finished a show called Fauda.
I love that. I see that on Netflix, right?
It's so good. It's on Netflix. This is the 3rd season that just came out. And I finished it probably in 2.5, 3 days. And it's an Israeli show about an elite Israeli force hunting terrorists. That's
heavy.
Yeah, it is. People say it's like Homeland, which I've actually never seen, but
I've never seen Homeland either.
I just started watching The Last Dance, which is about the 97-98 Chicago Bulls.
No idea.
so good. I grew up
Really?
in Chicago, so it's great. It brings me back to my childhood. And then, there's one other show. Oh, Billions just came out.
Just started watching Billions again, so always
Yeah.
good fun. Rebecca,
Yeah.
this is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Your most important meeting of today should be the virtual happy hour at 5 p.m. If you can join us. If not, always a pleasure. Looking forward to all of us getting back together as in person for the next seminars and webinars that we've got. But thank you so much.
Very much so. Thank you for having me. And I appreciate you doing all this in the midst of everything that's going on.
Thank you. All righty. We'll chat soon.
Okay.